Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Phillips again. I'm going to deliver a few prepared things to you today regarding the Antigone reading. I thank so much the five of you who took the time to participate so far in the discussion list on Cornell West. I was hoping all of you would. I mean, this is a really big deal. I'm not sure if that's totally or universally appreciated. But I'm hoping the other seven who have not participated will choose to do so. It's very meaningful, and the discussions themselves further and deepen our thinking, discovering our thinking, and can help us today as Dr. West speaks to us and developing questions that we might have for him in the very, very intensive hour that we're going to have with him. And it's such a blessing and an honor. He's an autonomous human being. And what does that mean? It means somebody who, in some ways, lives by his own moral code, and kind of like Antigone. And I mean, Plato, the philosopher, elaborates a kind of a paradigm-shattering conception of what it is to have a healthy soul. He outlines that in his Republic. And to me, Antigone is the epitome of somebody with a healthy soul. So for Plato's purposes, for all intents and purposes, he was describing his mentor Socrates. But also he was describing that paradigmatic autonomous persona of fiction, Antigone. Now, Sophocles, who wrote the play Antigone and other brilliant works, was a near contemporary of Socrates. And so he also witnessed the great rise, the halcyon days of ancient Athens, of the Athenian polis, and the precipitous decline. He witnessed the 30-year exhausting Peloponnesian War the Athenians launched against Sparta. In many ways, a naked land grab, although there are other reasons for it. But Athens ended up exhausting its military, depleting its own resources, and it led to a very precipitous decline in Athenian society. People who had embraced the life of arete, A-R-E-T-E, the life of all-around excellence, suddenly turned in on themselves and shunned it. It happened so startlingly quickly, and it's a real cautionary tale for any open society that loses its way, that no longer shoots for the goals of human excellence, in which duty to self and duty to others goes hand in glove, and in which a sort of malignant, extreme narcissism takes over, and that becomes virtue instead of vice. And Sophocles witnessed that, and maybe we'll never be able to know for sure, but the fact that he could even come up with a character so timeless and so brilliant as Antigone, I think speaks volumes about what was on his mind and heart, and how we might still be autonomous in the sense that not go it alone totally, but to act in a certain way like Socrates did, to set an example, not just for one's peers, not just for those of one's own time and clime, but for those to come. Even if and as one's own society is in decline, it may be even more important for people of conscience, of honor, of virtue, people who live what the Greeks call arete, to stand up and be counted. And so Sophocles, as a playwright, he may not have influenced directly Socrates, but nonetheless, this notion of being an autonomous soul certainly spoke to Socrates. But so in Antigone's case, she obeyed a higher law, regardless of prevailing ethical mores. She rejected the edict or the ukase of King Creon in the play in order to bury her brother as her gods dictated. So the king, because she did that, the king sentenced her to be buried alive. And by the time he had a last-minute change of heart, Antigone had taken her death into her own hands and had hanged herself rather than suffer from the king's barbaric form of execution. And so likewise, Socrates, and you'll be reading about him in these upcoming dialogues of Plato's, Socrates, for his pious impiety, for corrupting the youth by showing them how to ask why questions, and to question authorities, to question superiors, to question the gods, the pantheon of gods that existed, and whether they simply propped up the people, the demagogues in power, the oligarchy. He showed them how to think for themselves, heaven forbid. And he did this in some ways out of obeisance to a different pantheon of gods than the state-sponsored ones. And that was also a capital crime. But that gave license to the pervading sickness that had taken over his society. And so Socrates was sentenced to death, much like Antigone, for obeying a higher law. But such are these healthy souls who are the epitome of autonomy and of social conscience. So autonomy and social conscience clearly aren't at opposite ends of a continuum, but they're inseparable. Now, if you really want to read some cool stuff, you should check out some of the works of the naturalist, transcendentalist philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, who also talks about what it means to live by your own code. And he even mentions a term that Plato mentions and that Shakespeare mentions called soul of goodness. But throughout our lives, from Nelson Mandela to Sojourner Truth to Malala Yousafzai, the student who was shot by the Taliban for daring to promote education for young women, Edith Cowan, Shirley Colleen Smith, Chiun Sugihara, these, and not to mention Socrates and Antigone. When Socrates cashed in his mortal chips, he was doing it mostly not out of just despair, but to set an example that you shouldn't give in or kowtow to those who demand that you live by a code that you find morally repugnant, morally corrosive, and corrupt, because he was thinking about the bigger picture in the much longer haul. So it's no surprise that Socrates, across the generations and across cultures, has spoken to so many other souls who believe that a certain kind of examined life, where we believe it's incumbent upon us to become enlightened generalists, and to be able to question and challenge and look at the logical lapses and loopholes of those who claim to be the authorities and the experts. Not just to stump anybody, not just to pull the rug out from anybody, but as a key way of being an engaged and involved citizen and coming up with prescriptive solutions to what ails us. But to do that, you have to be clear-eyed, and you have to look at where your society is. Is it still willing to recognize its contradictions and look at where its promise and practice are not in alignment, and then have that critical self-awareness and reflection and dialogues among diverse people where you're not just seeking common ground, you're not just philosophizing, but you're also trying to come up with solutions to society's more intractable roles. And when a society no longer even cares to turn that critical lens on itself, it may hark of not great times to come, to put it mildly. But so there are such people who live by their own moral codes. These people know that there is the potential for good and for evil in many more of us than we might care to acknowledge. And that but for a circumstance here, a turn of events there, many people might have turned out far differently than they have. Now, I'm going to sort of look at leapfrog to U.S. history and talk about Thomas Jefferson for a little bit, because when Thomas Jefferson was asked whether there were occasions when one could act outside the letter of the law, as Antigone did, she acted outside of the king's orders in good conscience. Thomas Jefferson, he also went to William and Mary like I did a few years earlier than I did. Thomas Jefferson replied that, quote, "While the strict observance of the written laws is doubtless one of the highest duties of a good citizen, it is not the highest." In other words, Jefferson believed that there were, quote unquote, laws of necessity, of self-preservation, of saving one's country when in danger, which are of higher obligation than constitutional law, than royal ukase, like of the King Creat. For him to lose our country by scrupulous adherence to written law would be to lose the law itself, with life, liberty, property, and all those who are enjoying them with us, thus observably sacrificing the ends to the means. Now, one of our most renowned Supreme Court justices in the United States, the late Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, who before he became a justice was a very exalted civil rights lawyer, and of course the first African American appointed to the Supreme Court, he echoed this view of Thomas Jefferson's in his autobiography. So Thurgood Marshall believed that there is something higher than the Constitution. As he put it, that is quite simply the people. Thurgood Marshall wrote, "I do not mean that the people are not bound to live under our system of laws, but what I do mean is what Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence, that just governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed. And because of this, you have not only the right, but also a responsibility to the government of this country." So you might ask yourself, when is it time to stand up and be counted and to deviate from given laws, whether in the name of evolving and making sure your society stays on the right track? By Thurgood Marshall's perspective, by Antigone's perspective, by Thomas Jefferson's perspective, citizens have a civic responsibility to make sure that the government is working in a way that does right by everyone. And so to that end, Thurgood Marshall contended that in the case of America, citizens must be loyal above all else to embracing, quote unquote, all of the qualities that Jefferson embodied. Recognizing his faults and foibles, don't get me wrong, recognizing Jefferson's contradictions. Nonetheless, the commitment to difficult projects, confidence in the soundness of one's own vision, and perseverance in working through a problem. That takes honesty, that takes critical reflection, that takes a willingness to experiment and try things out. Sometimes you'll fall flat on your face. But Antigone, in her time and clime, even though a fictional character, was an exemplary of this in a time and clime when Athens was in decline. And surely, I would think Sophocles felt it was necessary. And it emerged from all this persona, this timeless persona of Antigone. I mean, read the work thinking about the time in which Sophocles lived and in which Socrates lived, in which Athens had a period of great ascent, of creativity, almost, childlike playfulness, where the poets and playwrights and philosophers and scientists, there was no breakdown or division between knowledge categories. And they were always pushing one another to further push out the boundaries of what human knowledge, but not just human knowledge, but what human being could be all about, what human doing and making could be all about. And so when you come across a period in your own epic, if you recognize some of those same patterns, dangerous or pernicious patterns are repeating themselves, maybe ask yourself, what do I do? What can I do? What shall I do? What must I do? That's a lot to put on any one person's shoulders, but the idea, of course, is not to feel as someone who lives by personal autonomy that you're a lone wolf, but maybe this will also resonate with others. You just never know until you get in the mix. So I want you to think about Sophocles, the playwright himself, and Antigone, this extraordinary character and persona who I've been thinking about and considering since I was about 9 years old. My Greek grandmother, my yaya, kind of foisted all this work of Sophocles and Plato's Socrates on me when I was really young. She was so passionate about her Greek heritage and patrimony. And I'm so glad she did. This stayed sort of dormant, sleeping inside of me for a long time. But I think that if you really immerse yourself in this work, understanding that, and asking yourself, well, what does it mean to me to be an autonomous, self-governing soul? How does that help liberate me? Does it help liberate me? And does it help set others free as well, or how can it? If you think about all that instead of reading this work in a vacuum, I think you'll get much more meaning. And it doesn't in any way mean you have to agree with what she did or what Socrates did. It just means you might ask yourself, well, when might I stand up and be counted? Would I ever? Or is it simply not something that I choose to do? Is it maybe not in my makeup? And is that okay? When is it important to at least challenge or question authority, or is that never good? When should one go against one's family's wishes and desires? All of those things speak to personal autonomy, self-governance, but in a greater context of human freedoms themselves. What example do we help to set for others? Do we even think in terms of setting examples for others, for our contemporaries, much less as Socrates did for a generation to come or 5 generations to come, much less 500 or 1,000 generations to come? How many people still have that long-term sense of human vision, imaginative vision, where they put their acts in a context where you're not maybe necessarily self-consciously thinking about, oh, I'm going to leave this great legacy, but just cognizant of the fact that there are those who came before you and that there will be those, hopefully, who will come long, long, long after you, and to put your actions in that context, whether it's the most everyday action or something that may be unexpected. As I said in my last lecture, Martin Luther King himself was sort of an accidental activist. There was nothing in the cards that would have seemed to point the way for him to become this extraordinary human being he was. That makes me go back and read so many of his speeches and talks and videos, see him talking himself, that still resonate and speak to us across the chasms and across cultures and times ever since. So think about all those things as you're reading and pondering Sophocles and Antigone, and what an extraordinary character she was. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Socrates, in the context of this course. Thanks a lot. Write me if you have any questions.